Okay, it is now 8 p.m. Eastern, so I would love to welcome everyone to the final part of this three-class series in connection with Trisha's summer kollel on the theme of universalism and particularism. Tonight, we are joined by Rabbi Dr. Sam Lebens for a session called Exploring Rabbi Sacks on the Universal and the Particular. Rabbi Dr. Sam Lebens is a research fellow in the philosophy department at the University of Haifa and a dynamic Jewish educator. He holds a PhD. You laughing at your own bio? I didn't write it.
Kind of you.
He holds a PhD in philosophy from Birkbeck College in the University of London and held postdoctoral positions at the University of Notre Dame and Rutgers. His thesis was the defense of Bertrand Russell's theory of assertion. He is also an ordained Orthodox Rabbi, having studied at various Israeli rabbinical schools, including Yeshivat HaKotel, Yeshivat HaMivtar, and Yeshivat Har Etzion. His most recent book is The Principles of Judaism from Oxford University Press. Sam's academic interests span the philosophy of religion, metaphysics, epistemology, and the philosophy of language. He is also the co-founder and the chair of the Association for the Philosophy of Judaism. So we encourage you to ask questions either by unmuting yourself or putting questions in the chat or in the comments on Facebook. If you are comfortable doing so, we would love for you to turn on your camera and actively participate so we can feel we are all together in this virtual space. And without further ado, Dr. Sam Lebens.
Thank you. Sarah, let me know if there are questions in Facebook, yeah? Thank you. And feel free just to raise them at any time. It's a great honor to be here, and especially to be talking about Rabbi Sacks. We're still in the year of his passing, and I was privileged to have a close relationship with Rabbi Sacks. And as soon as I heard the theme on universalism and particularism, I thought to speak about Rabbi Sacks because these were recurring notions throughout his work. So our first slide, oh, hi, Mina. Our first slide just popped up on my screen. Is a little quote from one of his earlier books from the early 90s called Crisis and Covenant, which were the written up version of a lecture series he gave at the University of Manchester, kind of on the history of Jewish thought. And he says there, this might be the first time in print where he kind of meditates on this theme. I'm not exactly sure if that's true, but it's plausible. He says, Judaism embodies a unique paradox that has distinguished it from polytheism on the one hand, and the great universal monotheisms, Christianity and Islam, on the other. Its God is universal, the creator of the universe, author and sovereign of all human life, but its covenant is particular, one people set among the nations, whose vocation is not to convert the world to its cause, but to be true to itself and to God. So in the kollel this summer, I've had the privilege and joy of teaching, and we've been talking about proselytism, about the attempt of religions to persuade non-members of the truth of their religion and to persuade them to convert to their religion. And Judaism is noteworthy for its lack of proselytism, its eschewal of any sort of obligation to go out and recruit new members. Of course, conversion is possible, and indeed there's a Gemara in Masechet Psachim, according to which the only reason the Jews were sent into such a far-flung exile was to absorb the righteous converts who eventually find their way to us. Nevertheless, that hasn't translated in any serious way into an accompanying notion that there should be an obligation to seek, actively seek converts, proselytes. And according to Rabbi Sacks, that's very much on purpose. Judaism embodies what he calls a paradoxical embrace of both the universal and the particular. Like the great proselytizing religions, Christianity and Islam, the great proselytizing monotheistic religions, we believe that there's one God who created all of us. But unlike them, we believe that our religion is a particular covenant between God and a particular people. And it was never designed to be a covenant between God and everybody. So that's the first thing to note, that Rabbi Sacks thought this was a very distinctive feature of Judaism. The second quote we'll look at is from the same book. And yet, you may think that it comes from The Dignity of Difference, which was one of Rabbi Sacks's most famous books. It was also a controversial book. It caused him to put out a second edition with perhaps less controversially phrased claims, because The Dignity of Difference was a book that seemed to embrace a very radical pluralism about religions. Not within Judaism. Rabbi Sacks was, sometimes controversially so, was quite rigidly Orthodox. He wrote a book called One People, in which he argued that orthodoxy can adopt a much more inclusive attitude to non-Orthodox Jews than perhaps it traditionally does. But he felt that there were limits, because he felt that orthodoxy makes a claim to some sort of unique legitimacy within the Jewish nation, that orthodoxy is the true religion of the Jewish people. Though we should be open-minded and inclusive towards those Jews who disagree, it has this kind of uniqueness claim within Judaism. However, he thought that Orthodox attitudes to non-Jewish religions could actually be much, much more pluralistic than Orthodoxy's attitude to non-Orthodox denominations of Judaism. And The Dignity of Difference was the book in which he articulated most stridently that religious pluralism. He went so far as to say in the first edition of that book that Judaism is the language in which God spoke to the Jews, Islam is the language in which God spoke to the Muslims, Christianity is a language in which God spoke to the Christians. That got him in a lot of trouble within his own Orthodox backyard. And the second edition, though he claims in a quite forthright preface to the second edition, he claims that he isn't recanting anything. He's merely rewording exactly what he said in the first preface in a way that will be better understood. It was certainly widely taken as something of a U-turn. Nevertheless, you can see the seeds of much of the Dignity of Difference really early on in the last chapter of Crisis and Covenant, which is a meditation in part upon the story of Babel. Now, this picture on the right, this famous painting of the Tower of Babel, is also the front cover of the Dignity of Difference. It appears on the front cover of the Dignity of Difference. Rabbi Sacks always saw the story of Babel as a central source of a type of pluralism towards non-Jewish faiths. Where this comes from is he looks at the divine response to Babel. And what is the divine response? It's to divide humanity into a multiplicity of languages, peoples, and cultures. It's as if the people of Babel came together with one language, and God said, that's not what I want. I want there to be difference. I want there to be diversity. I want there to be specifically cultural and linguistic diversity. To be sure, there is the promise implicit in Genesis and explicit in the prophets that one day, I'm sorry, I typed this really, it's also 3 a.m. here, so you have to excuse me for all sorts of errors, including typos, that one day mankind will be restored to its original harmony. So the prophets have a vision of a universal brotherhood of man, especially not all of the prophets, but especially Isaiah would be a key a source for that type of vision. But not yet. Not until the metaphysical end of days. That's the eschaton, that's Yemot HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah. But in the meantime, and for all historical time, human civilization is irreducibly plural. Cultures are distinct and cannot be translated into one another. Israel thus testifies in its very being to the oneness of God and to the plurality of man. In fact, he goes further in this passage. He wants to say, oh, thank you for thanking me for speaking so early or late in the day. That's a good question. Where is it implicit in Genesis that one day mankind will be restored to its original harmony? He doesn't say, so I guess it's very implicit. However, you might want to look at the last parsha of the last weekly reading, the last parsha of the book of Genesis, Parshat Vayechi, where Jacob intimates that he's going to gather all of the brothers together to tell them what will be in the end of days. Perhaps that's the first hint in Genesis that there's any type of messianism at all in the Bible. But like I said, that's very, very implicit. There's no notion that that end of days will be one in which there's universal harmony. In fact, according to the dominant rabbinic reading of that parsha, Jacob promises to tell the brothers about the end of days and then doesn't. And the book ends on a kind of anticlimax because for some reason or other, the divine vision, the prophetic vision of the end of days is taken away from Jacob at the last moment, which is kind of an anticlimax for the entire book of Genesis. But yes, it must be very implicit. But the extent to which messianism is hidden in the book of Genesis is made up for by how explicit it is in the book of Isaiah, at least. But Rabbi Sacks has a broader analysis of Babel, because one of the main points he wants to make is that the book of Genesis starts out with universal themes. It starts with the creation of mankind, all of humanity in the image of God, and then moves on to the story of Noach and the flood, which is also about the salvation and redemption of all mankind. And then the story of Babel, which is also including all mankind and carries this message that God has a kind of, so to speak, desire for there to be cultural and human diversity in this world, at least in the pre-Messianic days. Only then, after all of that prologue, does the Bible focus in on Abraham and the particular story of the Jewish people. In the introduction to his Siddur, which is a much later work of Rabbi Sacks, he points out that this structure of moving from the general to the particular is kind of the opposite direction to kind of Greek philosophy. Socrates was very interested in beginning with particular instances of a phenomenon and then moving out to a more general or abstract conclusion, whereas the Bible is like a counterpoint to Greek philosophy, because it starts with the general and then hones in on the particular. Rabbi Sacks also points out that that this structure of moving from the universal to the particular is mirrored throughout various prayer services in the Siddur. That's a really beautiful study that I didn't have time to include in the PowerPoint. Okay. What are the philosophical underpinnings of this peculiar, what Rabbi Sacks calls paradoxical appropriation of both the universal and the particular? One God, but yet many peoples and many cultures. Why did it have to be that way, according to Rabbi Sacks? Well, here's a picture of Wittgenstein over there. One of the most famous contributions that Wittgenstein made to philosophy, Ludwig Wittgenstein, is called the private language argument. And according to this argument, there can be no such thing as a private language. Languages are inherently social. Now, it's actually a controversial claim, and whether or not pre-linguistic children have some sort of private idiolect, some sort of internal language pre-wired into their brain, is an ongoing debate. But Wittgenstein tried to argue on purely philosophical grounds that the notion of a totally private language, a language that isn't shared between more than one person, is a nonsense. Hi, is there a way to be able to allow pinning on our end, or allow us the option to choose speak of you? I'm very small. I'm sorry to hear that, Michael. I'm actually quite a small person in general. So in that sense, at least, you're getting an accurate depiction of me. But I don't know about the technology here. Okay, so where was I? Yeah, Wittgenstein, private language argument. That's going to be somewhere in the background of this following quote, also from Covenant and Crisis, that final chapter. Oh, Crisis and Covenant. I never remember which one comes first. Anyway, implicit in Judaism, says Rabbi Sacks, is a deep analogy between faith and language. A language is spoken by a people. There's no such thing as a private language or a universal language. Now, I understand why he says there's no such thing as a private language. He doesn't cite Wittgenstein, but anybody who's well-versed in contemporary philosophy, if they hear somebody say there's no private language, you think Wittgenstein, because that was one of his most noteworthy contributions to Western philosophy, the private language argument. Why does he say there's no such thing as a universal language? Well, perhaps we'll get an inkling for why later on. Just hold the question. He says, we are born into a linguistic community. We do not choose to be born to English as against French-speaking parents, and yet that fact has the greatest significance in shaping our sensibilities. By speaking any natural language, we are participating in the history of a civilization. Its nuances of meaning and association were shaped by the past and yet persist into the present. And to speak a language is to internalize its rules of grammar and semantics. Without these rules, we cannot express ourselves articulately. Every word you use has a history, and it's almost as if the generations of people who used the language before you are somehow recalled in your use of words, because they shaped the words we have. They shaped the nuances that they have. But the thing is, given the fact that human beings live in different environments, from the plains of Africa to the mountain, to the Alps in Europe, to North America and the Asian subcontinent, it was almost bound to be the case that language would splinter, to the extent that there's no such thing as a universal human experience, a completely universal experience, to the extent that the natural climes in which we live impose themselves upon our culture, upon our way of life. It was almost inevitable that our languages would splinter so as to reflect those differences. So on the one hand, there can't be a completely private language, and on the other hand, post-Babel dispersion, given the fact that humanity has such a wide array of different experiences. Imagine the experiences of the Inuit and compare that to the experiences of Zulus, right? It shouldn't surprise us that we would develop over time different languages to reflect our different sensibilities, because our languages do much more than even we're aware of. Nietzsche has a beautiful comment on this, and Rabbi Sacks was a huge admirer of Nietzsche. Nietzsche speaks about language containing metaphors that we're almost unaware of. Says like the pictures of a coin that have been weared down through overuse. Sometimes we use a metaphor so often we forget it's even a metaphor. An example would be something like the legs of a table, right? That's a metaphor, right? Because it's imposing an anatomy upon a table, as if it has body parts. But we so often talk about the legs of a table or the face of a clock, that we're almost immune to the metaphors that our language deploys all the time. Nietzsche calls those metaphors dead metaphors as opposed to live metaphors. A live metaphor would be one that the speakers are kind of implicitly aware that, oh, this is a metaphor. It wears its metaphorical status much more clearly to us. So there's much more going on in a language than the mere description of states of affairs. And that's why so much is often lost in translation from one language to another language, because you can't hold on to all of the nuances in any given word when you replace it with a different word, especially from a different language. There are no true synonyms, in a natural language. What you have is words that could more or less express the same thing, but at least the nuances or associations that the word's going to carry, the etymology, the history of the word, it is going to be different. That's why they're not the same word. And Rabbi Sacks says that faith is like language in that sense. It does more than just describe a state of affairs. So take Christianity, Islam, Judaism, they all have a theology. And of course, in those theologies, they are making claims about the world. But they're doing so much more than that, because couched in the language of Islam, or couched in the language of Christianity, or couched in the language of Judaism, those systems of beliefs also carry a whole cultural history, a narrative, a set of nuances, a history of collective experience. And those things get lost in translation. And if you believe, as we'll get to this later, as I'm pretty sure Rabbi Sacks did, that not all knowledge is propositional. Now, that's a technical phrase. A proposition in philosophy is the meaning of a declarative sentence. What do I mean by that? A declarative sentence is a sentence which isn't a question, it's not an exclamation, it's not a demand, it's a description of the way things are, right? When you assert that things are thus and so, a proposition is the meaning of such a sentence, right? So Paris is the capital of France. England beat Denmark this evening, right? Those are declarations of how the world is. They could be true, they could be false. Those are called propositions. There is a growing body of philosophy according to which not all knowledge is propositional. Not everything that we know can be expressed within the grammar of a proposition. I'll give you an example. There's no way, by the way, we're going to get through all my slides tonight. I'm so sorry. There was so much more that I wanted to do. But there's a nice example that comes from a philosopher called Frank Jackson. We'll get through something called Frank Jackson, who imagines a brilliant neuroscientist called Mary. And she was born in a peculiar environment that philosophers arranged for her to be born into. She was born into a peculiar environment of only black and white. So her retina was never stimulated by any other wavelengths. She only ever saw black and white. But we imagine this is in the future when neuroscience is complete. And she's a brilliant neuroscientist. We give her all of the neuroscience books that she could ever want, all of the neuroscience videos, all in black and white, of course, okay? And she comes to know everything there is to know about the human experience of color, at least everything that can be said in propositional form. So she knows that when light hits the retina at a certain wavelength, English speakers are prone to say, "Ooh, that looks red to me." She knows that the experience of red comes along with certain cultural and psychological associations for certain people. She knows that roses are red, right? In that she knows they are experienced as red by people. Fine. One day she escapes her black and white prison, and for the first time in her life, she sees red. Now, ex hypothesi, given the thought experiment we're imagining, even before she escaped her prison, she knew every proposition there was to know about the human experience of red. And yet, we're inclined to think she learned something new when she actually saw redness. And the thought is that what she comes to learn is definitely something, but it's not something that could be couched within the grammar of a proposition. I think Rabbi Sacks thought that there is non-propositional knowledge. And I think that he thought that what gets lost in translation from one language to another is the sort of knowledge that can't necessarily be put into a sentence. It's kind of carried by sentences in the nuances, in the subtext of a sentence, but it can't be worn on the face of a sentence explicitly. So there is wisdom in Islam, and there is wisdom in Christianity, and there is wisdom in Judaism, quite in addition to the true propositions they may express. But that extra non-propositional wisdom is the sort of stuff that languages carry, that can't be translated from one language to another. They're culture bound. Now, in this final chapter of Crisis and Covenant, Rabbi Sacks engages in what will become, for his entire career, something of a crusade. It's not a really nice word to use about a Jewish thinker, a crusade against what he takes to be some of the main doctrines of the European Enlightenment, of early modernism. And I want to sketch some of the contours of this critique for you, because this is one of the areas in which the universalism and the particularism of his Jewish philosophy is most apparent. Remember, the universalism is that he does believe there are some truths, like there is one God who created the world, truths expressed by certain propositions. But he also thinks there are truths that can't be expressed by propositions and are somehow only known to particular cultures in particular contexts because they have access to a particular language. Now, here are some claims that you find in Enlightenment thought that Rabbi Sacks wants to react against. So the first is, according to Rabbi Sacks, Enlightenment ethics either gives rise to unfettered individualism, and that unfettered individualism has a number of different flavors. There's the Hobbesian flavor, which is, each person in the state of nature can do whatever they blooming well want to do. But it's in our own interests to come together and create a social contract where we limit some of our individual powers because it's a better deal that way, and that's the start of social contract theory. John Stuart Mill believes that in his book on liberty, believes that no government has the right to interfere with the consenting activity of adults, so long as that activity doesn't harm anybody other than those who have consented to take part. And what emerges from that is this basic notion that there are no wrongs and rights so long as you don't infringe upon other people's activity, other people's individuality, because really the only sacrosanct idea here is the sacredness of the individual, and each individual should be able to express him or herself to the fullest degree, so long as it doesn't impinge upon other individuals doing the same thing. In Nietzsche and Sartre, you get, oh, I spelled Sartre wrong, so it's terrible, sorry. But in Nietzsche and Sartre, you get an even more unfettered individualism, because they basically say there's no such thing as meaning, objective meaning to life. They're both nihilists. And the most that you can have is either self-expression or, in Sartre's kind of terminology, the creation of subjective meaning. So you get this kind of unfettered individualism stemming from some Enlightenment thinkers, or you get this notion that there is such a thing as ethics that have obligations and duties, rights, responsibilities. You get that from some early modern thinkers, but the system of ethics will be doggedly impartial, right? So all human beings are to be treated equally, irrespective of race, creed, nationality, or any other differentiating property. You see that in Kantian ethics, you see that in utilitarianism, you see that pretty much across the board. Another feature of Enlightenment thought is that God is an acceptable Enlightenment belief. Descartes believed in God, Leibniz believed in God, John Locke believed in God, Berkeley certainly believed in God. I'm not sure he believed in much else. Now, that's all fine. That's all fine. The kind of rise of atheism is associated with the Enlightenment, and certainly the rise of secularism. But atheism is not a necessary part of the Enlightenment. However, those who believed in God tended to believe in God as some sort of explanatory posit. There must be a God because without God you can't explain X, Y, and Z. Right? And you see that in Leibniz, for example, or there must be a God because there is some logical proof or other. So Descartes tries to prove that God exists purely from what you might call the axioms of logic, right? So there is a God that exists, but it's a kind of explanatory posit, much like, you know, the Higgs boson. You know, until the hadron collider, sorry, nobody had bumped into a Higgs boson or even knew they existed, but we figured they must because it helps to explain loads of other stuff. And the God of Enlightenment is something like that. Okay. Another characteristic of Enlightenment thought, and this is particularly dedicated in this notion, is particularly associated with Kant, that ultimately ethics is self-legislating. So you only have duties insofar as you are capable of recognizing them, reasoning yourself into the position that helps you to see that you have such a duty, and nobody else has the right to impose that upon you. Okay, another characteristic is that ethics is grounded in reason. Okay, so the reason you have duties, if you really do have duties, is because reason reveals this to you. Okay, now that's definitely there in Kant, but I would say it's also there in John Stuart Mill and other ethicists, of Enlightenment and Western thought post-Enlightenment. I'm going to get onto the modern conception of the self a little bit later on. Okay, so what does Rabbi Sacks have to say about all of this? Well, first of all, he says Judaism can't allow for unfettered individualism because Judaism thinks of people as being born into communities. And that fact, that biological fact, can carry a certain ethical weight. You might be born with obligations upon your shoulders just in virtue, by dint of being born into a community. More on that later. Rabbi Sacks thinks that we have ethical obligations that are particular. For example, God entered into a particular covenant with the Jewish people, which created particular responsibilities between God and the Jewish people that don't necessarily extend beyond the borders of the Jewish people. It created responsibilities from Jew to Jew that don't necessarily extend from Jew to non-Jew. That's not to say we don't also have responsibilities to non-Jews. We do. And that's not to say that God doesn't have a relationship with non-Jews. He does. But the Jewish ethical system is predicated on the notion that specific relationships can generate specific duties. And that seems to be in conflict with this notion of dogged impartiality. I'll carry on. According to Judaism, on Rabbi Sacks's view of things, God is a person. And because he's a person, he's actually one of those things that can't be known exclusively or exhaustively through propositional knowledge. For instance, Eleanor Stump, a Catholic philosopher at St. Louis University, she says, imagine Mary again, but imagine this time that she never got to meet her mother because evil philosophers kept her far apart from her mother, and she also never got to have an interpersonal relationship with anybody. Instead, faceless prison guards would put books through a letterbox in her cell. She read all about personal relationships, but she never had one. Moreover, she read an absolutely exhaustive biography of her darling mother who wants for nothing more than her good and wishes she could free her from this prison. She read an exhaustive biography about her mother. In fact, she knew every true proposition there was to know about her mother. And then she escapes from the prison and she gets to stand in the gaze of her mother. Does she learn something new about her mother? And Eleanor Stump thinks she does. And she thinks there's this thing called second personal knowledge. To know another as a you, or to know another, to use Buber's language, to know another as a thou rather than an it, right? To stand in the gaze of another and to experience them in that distinctively second personal way. Rabbi Sacks says the Jewish people knew God first and foremost through personal experience of him. God spoke to Abraham, God freed us from Egypt, God revealed himself at Mount Sinai. And therefore, God isn't known primarily as an explanatory posit or as the conclusion of a logical proof. He's a person with whom we have interpersonal relations. And the knowledge that we have of him is far outstretched, is far wider than the propositional knowledge that we have of God. In fact, our propositional knowledge of God might be very scant. Maimonides thinks that we're better off saying what God isn't than what God is when it comes to propositional knowledge. But that doesn't mean that we don't have personal knowledge of God. What about all this stuff about ethics? Well, now I'm going to need more space on the slide. So here we go. According to Rabbi Sacks, Judaism doesn't think that ethics is self-legislated. This comes back to something we've already said. Judaism sees morality, like language, as an essentially shared enterprise, a phenomenon not of individuals, but of communities. It's almost like, just like a language can't be private, ethics can't be private either, right? Because ethics is about interpersonal relationships. And some of those you are born into. You don't have a choice about who your mother is, however much some of you may have wanted the choice, right? God doesn't give you the choice. You don't have a choice who your father is. And yet the mere existence of those relationships into which you are born can generate obligation. A society of autonomous moralities would resemble the state of affairs described at the end of the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's a description not of moral law, but of moral chaos. Like I said, just like a language can't be private, moral obligation can't be either. Moreover, and this is related, morality isn't grounded in sort of reason or logic. It's grounded in relationship. Think of Levinas and again Buber. They have this idea that obligation emerges from the gaze of another. When you experience another person as a second person, as a thou rather than an it, as a you rather than an object, you immediately feel compelled to respect certain rights or to respect their dignity. The experience itself is kind of obligation generating, the experience of another person. So it's not logic that gives rise to ethics, it's interpersonal relations that give rise to ethics. Now, what about the modern conception of the self, which I said I'd get back to? Well, this is where Rabbi Sacks's communitarianism comes in. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute, and then for Michael, I might be bigger for a while. Communitarianism is a philosophy that emerged in the 1980s with thinkers like Alistair McIntyre, Michael Sandel, Charles Taylor, a group of philosophers with whom Rabbi Sacks was deeply enamored. And they were liberals, political liberals, but they came with a critique of classical liberalism. And their critique was the following. Liberalism imagines that each individual is kind of a discrete unit, an inviolable, sacrosanct, autonomous bearer of rights. It's not up to the state who you should be. It's not up to your family who you should be. It's not up to your community who you should be. It's up to you. You have freedom of choice. And those freedoms are only limited when they have to be, because the individual, the autonomous individual, is the center of the ethical universe of classical liberalism. John Rawls in the 1970s came out with an absolute classic of classical liberalism, a book that will be undoubtedly, in my opinion, studied for generations as a kind of climax, perhaps, of centuries or over a century of liberal political philosophy. And he tries to explain the basic contours of his liberalism with the following thought experiment. I'm going to adapt it only ever so slightly in order to make it a little bit more accessible. Imagine, if you will, that the entire world in which we live is like a virtual reality game. And actually, you're just a player in the game. You know, before you were born, you put on a headset, and then the first experience of the game was being born. It's a very long game, but eventually you'll get to take it off as well, you know. Now, before you put the headset on, you got together with all of the other players, because everybody else in this world is also, you know, being controlled by one of these people in a headset. You got together with all of the other players, and you were allowed to choose what would be the laws of the society into which you're going to be born. Okay, he calls this the original position. Imagine now that you're in the original position before you put the headset on. Okay, but the original position is behind what he calls a veil of ignorance. And what he means by that is that in the original position, you don't know whether you're going to be born a man or a woman. You don't know what your biological or social gender assignment is going to be. You don't know if you're going to be born into a rich family or a poor family. You don't know if you're going to be, to what extent you're going to be able-bodied. You're basically, you don't know what your race is going to be. You don't know what religion you're going to be born into. All of those things are kept from you. Says John Rawls, a just society is a society governed only by laws that people would choose in the original position behind the veil of ignorance. Because obviously there wouldn't be any racist laws because nobody knows what race they're going to be. Obviously there would be protections against sexism and gender discrimination and there would be progressive laws about accessibility for people with disabilities, etc., etc. Because in the original position, nobody knows what they're going to be, and what situation they're going to be born into. Those laws, the laws that would be unanimously agreed to in the original position behind a veil of ignorance, those are the laws of a just society. And John Rawls is magnum opus called The Theory of Justice, or A Theory of Justice, or just Theory of Justice, I think. But anyway, that magnum opus is dedicated to figuring out, well, what would people choose in that situation? And in that discussion, he's guided by rational decision theory. He talks about what would be most rational. The communitarian critique of liberalism can be best articulated as a critique of this thought experiment. And that's exactly how Michael Sandel begins his critique in Liberalism and Its Discontents. Or no, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. He says, what do you mean? What would I decide to do in original position behind a veil of ignorance? There is no me left. Once you've taken away my race, my gender, my sexual orientation, my religion, my culture, it's as if John Rawls has this conception shared by liberals that underneath all of the various identities that we wear, underneath all of the cultural baggage that we carry, underneath all of the kind of communal affiliations and associations that bind us into interpersonal networks, underneath all of that, there's this purely rational agent, right? And that thing could make choices in the original position, and the choices that thing makes, that we'd all agree to, and that would be just. And Michael Sandel's point is there is no such thing as that thing, because a human being is essentially communal. A human being is a situated being. It's born into a social context, and that social context shapes who they are. Now, Sandel is still a liberal. He doesn't want to live in a country that kind of legislates communal identity and forces people to remain in the communities into which they're born. He wants people to have individual freedoms. He does. But he also recognizes that we can't, as liberals, we can't begin our theorizing from an untrue, certainly unrealistic, but more than that, untrue conception of what the self is. Now, Rabbi Sacks thought that this conception of the self was a major feature of all Enlightenment thought, and he thought that it was misguided. Indeed, I take it that Rabbi Sacks signs on quite wholeheartedly to the communitarian critique of liberalism. Now, to move on, here's a quote where you start to see his communitarian leanings. He says, the constitutive idea of Judaism itself is that Jews are born into obligations. A Jew is a Jew by virtue of birth. That this fact carries with it certain duties and obligations. Membership of the Jewish community is thus simultaneously a biological and ethical proposition. Jews do not choose the commands by which they are bound, right? Because we are inherently situated beings. The next theme I wanted to develop, but we only have like 10 minutes, is a theme that comes up repeatedly in the thought of Rabbi Sacks. It's a distinction that he draws between Torah and wisdom. Now, its source in the sages starts with this very moving verse from the Book of Lamentations, an appropriate verse to think about at this time of year. It's talking about, of course, the destruction of the first temple, even though the picture is a hint towards the destruction of the second temple. But you know, let's not be pedantic. The verse says, "Tava'u va'aretz sha'areya," the gates of Jerusalem or the temple have sunken into the ground. "Ibad v'shibar baricheya," he has smashed her bars to bits. "Malka v'sareya," her kings and ministers or her kings and leaders, "B'goyim," are in exile, or literally they are among the nations. "Ein Torah," instruction is no more, or more literally, there is no Torah. Gam neviyeya lo matzeu chazon me'Hashem. Even her prophets, or also her prophets, are receiving no vision from God. Now, Rabbi Sacks loved a particular midrash that I think he probably quoted more than any other single midrash in the rabbinic canon. I may be wrong about that, but I would certainly not be surprised if I'm right. My intuition is that that's the case. It's from Eicha Rabbah, the collection of midrashim on the book of Eicha. And the midrash says, "Im yomar lecha adam yesh chochma b'goyim." If somebody were to say to you, there is wisdom among the Gentiles, ta'amen, you should believe it. Adahu dichtiv, after all, isn't it written? V'havadati chachamim me'adam u'tvuna me'ha'isav. I will remove the sages from Edom, and I will remove understanding from the mountain of Esau, implying that there are sages of Edom, that there is understanding in Esau, and perhaps in other religions, in other nations too. There's wisdom among the nations. Yofi. Carries on. Yesh Torah b'goyim. But if they tell you there is Torah among the nations, al ta'amen, don't believe it. That can't be true. Dichtiv, as it's written in our verse, Malka v'sareya b'goyim, her kings and ministers are among the nations. There is no Torah. I think part of the limud here is to move the comma, and it means something like they're reading the verse as among the nations there is no Torah, but goyim ain't Torah. Right? That's how the rabbis are reading that verse. Rabbi Sacks thought this led to a fundamental distinction between Torah on the one hand and wisdom on the other. So I want to share with you, this is a quote from Covenant and Conversation on Parshat Yitro, but it echoes many of his other writings on this topic. He writes about it in his Haggadah, and he writes about it elsewhere. Judaism, he says, has a dual epistemology, a dual theory of knowledge. There is chokhmah, wisdom, which is the universal heritage of mankind. By the way, I think it's entirely propositional, chokhmah, wisdom. It flows from the definition of humanity as the image and likeness of God. Rashi translates in our likeness as meaning with the capacity to understand and discern. All human beings have this. On the other hand, there is Torah, the covenant binding Israel to the sovereignty of God. There is nothing universal about this. Torah flows from the highly specific historical experience of the patriarchs and their descendants. It sets forth a unique code of sanctity by which the people were to govern their lives. About this, the psalm says, he's revealed his word to Jacob, his laws and decrees to Israel. He has done this for no other nation. Only the Jews have Torah. But what does that really mean? Because when I'm sitting and I'm learning the book of Job, for example, at the moment, because 929 is focusing on the book of Job, I'm reading Eleanor Stump, my favorite philosophers, a Catholic, on the book of Job. Is that not Torah? Can she teach me nothing about the Torah? Is that something I now have to believe because of this midrash in Eicha? Well, he carries on and he says, he's trying to explain what the difference is between Torah and wisdom. He says, among the differences are these: wisdom is the truth we discover by reason, observation, and experience. Torah is the truth we inherit. Revealed at Sinai, it has been handed on from generation to generation. Wisdom teaches us facts, Torah teaches us laws. Wisdom tells us how the world is, Torah tells us how it ought to be. Wisdom is subject to proof. Torah requires something else, authentication, meaning that it has to come down to us through the centuries by way of a reliable chain of transmission from sage to sage. That's why Moses Maimonides can write in his commentary to the Mishnah, accept the truth, whoever says it. The sages, by contrast, said, he who repeats a teaching in the name of the person who first said it brings redemption to the world. For the sages, who said it is crucial. For Maimonides, it's irrelevant. There is, however, no disagreement between them because they're talking about different things. Maimonides about wisdom, the sages about Torah. I would suggest that Torah in this usage, because the word Torah can mean many different things. Sometimes it means just the 5 books of Moses. Sometimes it means something much wider. I think in this particular usage, it has a much narrower meaning. It means the non-propositional wisdom that's carried, for example, in the nuances of Hebrew, in the ritual of the Jewish people, in the transmission of tradition from one generation to the next generation. But anything that can be said in a sentence and expressed propositionally without being lost in translation, that's wisdom. And in fact, Rabbi Sacks is quite clear that the Tanakh includes wisdom as well as Torah, which is to say the Torah includes wisdom as well as Torah, because sometimes we use the word Torah to mean Tanakh, right? He says the following. This is also from Covenant and Conversation on Parshat Yitro. There is a phrase in current circulation which is profoundly unhelpful. Limudei chol, secular studies. Wisdom, which today would include the natural, biological, and social sciences, mathematics, logic, history, and literature, is not secular in Judaism. To the contrary, wisdom is a biblical category. Several books of Tanakh, especially Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, by the way, right, to which I've been appealing to the help of my mentor, Eleanor Stump, are dedicated to it. It's called the wisdom literature. The sages even coined a special blessing to be recited on seeing one of the sages of the nations of the world. Blessed are you, O God, Master of the universe, King of the universe, who has given of his wisdom to flesh and blood. My custom, said Rabbi Sacks, is to recite it on seeing a Nobel Prize winner. Despite the fact that wisdom is not Torah, nor is it in any way special to the people of Israel, it is nonetheless a profoundly religious phenomenon. The difference between wisdom and Torah corresponds to the 2 primary aspects of God, creation and revelation. By wisdom, we come to understand God through his creation. By Torah, we understand God through his revelation. This suggests a quite new way of looking at secular studies and their place in a religious life. They are not secular at all. Instead, we can define wisdom as everything that leads us better to understand the universe as the work of God and humanity as the image of God. Perhaps to be more precise on his behalf, it might be everything propositional that we can learn about the universe as the work of God and humanity as the image of God. The stuff which is non-propositional can only be conveyed by the nuances, the color, the tone of a language. And a language can only take on nuances, color, and tone within a particular community. And that's why every faith community may well have infinitely precious wisdom, but there's a sense in which that wisdom is trapped within the language of that community. And our precious wisdom that's trapped within the language of our community is called Torah, and that's why it's particular. So these are some of the ways in which Rabbi Sacks developed his interest in the universal and the particular, namely one, in a quite broad critique of Enlightenment thought, and two, in this distinction between Torah and wisdom, which maps on quite neatly to the distinction between the universal and the particular. The final thing I'll say is that I'm teaching this course at the moment in Drisha about why it is that the Jewish or the rabbis didn't encourage us to go out and proselytize. And one of the things we've been looking at is the extent to which conversion for the rabbis was an issue, was a matter of declaring one's affinity to the Jewish people, almost more than it was about declaring one's belief in God or Jewish law. Now, I don't believe that's because the rabbis didn't care about God or Jewish law. I think they cared about it deeply. But I think that they recognized that only when you are rooted within a community can you understand the non-propositional wisdom somehow embedded in the language and ritual of that community. And the things that Judaism has to teach cannot be communicated to a person who isn't so situated. And therefore, I think that there's actually much deeper rabbinical roots. The only source we've looked at, the only rabbinic source we've looked at, other than the works of Rabbi Sacks, who was a rabbi, was this midrash in Eicha Rabbah. But I think if you delve deeply, especially into topics to do with conversion, you will see that the rabbis had quite a distinct appreciation of what would one day, many centuries later, become the communitarian critique of liberalism, that human beings are communally situated beings, and that meaning and that ethical responsibility are communally generated. Okay, that is all I have to say. Karen has raised her hand. I know we've gone over, but I'm happy to take a question.
Karen, you should be able to unmute yourself now if you'd like to, or you can put in the chat. Oh, I just see it says, thank you, very interesting. Great, Jason, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Lebens, or Rabbi Lebens, I'm not sure.
You can call me Sam, okay?
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Sam. I guess it's 4 a.m. in the morning over there, so thank you so much for the early morning Torah.
Orange juice.
Yeah. I know Noah sent in the chat some interesting podcasts or webinars of yours, but I hope you didn't mind my annoying chats. I know that can be annoying, especially when you're presenting. But could you just talk about a little bit more, like how Rabbi Sacks reconciled this disagreement with Maimonides and him saying that, like, God is I'm probably misquoting you, God is a human being, or we experience him. I'm not, like, you said something along those lines, and it seemed inconsistent with Maimonides.
So, as my friend and colleague and mentor, Professor Joseph Stern, who's a great Maimonides expert, says about Maimonides, the thing about Maimonides is every scholar has his own Maimonides, right? So every scholar has his own Maimonides. Maimonides is very, very difficult to interpret, famously. To what extent, first of all, does Rabbi Sacks feel beholden to be consistent with Maimonides is an interesting question, and to what extent Rabbi Sacks might be a critic of some aspects of Maimonidean thought is an interesting question. But in what I said in this talk, I think my point was as follows. On one reading of Maimonides, and in fact, this really is Maimonides, when Maimonides limits what we can say and know about God, the limitation is only relevant to propositional knowledge of God. So almost every sentence that you could, declarative sentence that you could frame about God is going to be at best misleading, at worst false, and normally meaningless for Maimonides, because God can't be tamed to fit into the subject-predicate structure of sentences in a language. However, that doesn't rule out the possibility that we have other sorts of knowledge of God. And in fact, on this reading of Maimonides, you need to put a lot of emphasis on the introduction to the Guide to the Perplexed, where he seems to talk about things which almost sound like a mystical experience, where the lightning flashes and everything's clear, but you can't communicate it. As soon as you try, you are sunk back into darkness. So to reconcile Rabbi Sacks and Maimonides, my thought was this: as soon as we try and say what God is propositionally, we fail. But that doesn't mean we don't know God. We have personal knowledge of God, and personal knowledge isn't actually propositional. It's that thing that Mary came to learn about her mother when she escaped from the prison and met her. And I think Rabbi Sacks would find that attractive. Now, I also think he was a critic of Maimonides and wouldn't have gone quite as far as Maimonides did, limiting the ability of language to at least say something. But I think his point in Crisis and Covenant was just that the God of Enlightenment thought, to the extent that Enlightenment philosophers were theists, all they had to say about God was propositional. But that's a completely different emphasis from the Jewish emphasis, both biblically, rabbinically, and even Maimonideanly, as you might read him. Does that help, Jason?
Yes, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So we have questions from Gilana and Nissan. I think we'll call it a night after that. So Gilana, would you like to go?
Ilana!
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. Great to see you and to learn from you again. I put a question in the chat, and I'm still thinking about that question and something a bit based off of it, which is about this idea of non-propositional knowledge that can't really be shared between religious groups and cultural groups. And so I'm wondering what, for Rabbi Sacks, or also from your perspective, perhaps what the implications of that are for interreligious dialogue. And then I'm also sort of thinking about this idea that that non-propositional logic can be shared, can be gained through getting to know people as people, and how that plays into sort of what if any is the value in, and what sort of can be accomplished through interreligious conversation.
Yeah, so in answer to the first question, Rabbi Sacks doesn't rule out, I think, in the ways that Rabbi Soloveitchik tried to in his work on interfaith dialogue. Rabbi Sacks doesn't rule out the possibility that there might be some people who are multilingual, right? Multilinguality, I don't know how to say that, is a possibility. It's just that even a multilingual person will accept, I can't actually there is something lost in translation when I try to translate something that I can say in one language to a different language. That doesn't mean that one person perhaps isn't capable of grasping the wisdoms that are embedded in more than one language. So I hope that helps a little bit. Rabbi Sacks also thought that obligation moves in concentric circles. So we have a relationship, and this is something that's shared with many communitarians and liberal nationalists as well, is that you have an immediate relationship to your next of kin, to your parents, to your spouse, to your children, and then you have a relationship to your community, to the people in your city, and then it moves out in concentric circles. You have obligations to people with whom you merely share humanity, right? There are obligations to all, but like I said, they move out in concentric circles. But I think Rabbi Sacks would say that every time you meet a new human being, you kind of you enter into a new relationship with its own kind of obligations, and in a sense, your life can become ever more meaningful, and your ethical universe can become ever thicker through the creation and sustenance of multiple friendships. And in his book, The Home We Build Together, he speaks about a side-by-side model rather than a face-to-face model. He said that, you know, the chasm between, let's say, faith A and faith B might be so wide that, you know, faith A just can't understand what faith B is talking about because there's so much lost in translation. However, if they stop trying to have a face-to-face dialogue, but just work side to side in pursuit of a common goal, like building a house together, they create bonds of mutuality. Now, he doesn't go so far as to say this, but I think it follows from what he says, that those new bonds of mutuality might actually create a language of their own. That might allow, you know, for one person to learn a different language in the context of relationship. So you know, like I said, I hope that helps a bit. One of the things, just to summarize, one of the things I most wanted to get across, somebody asked what the early work I was citing was. It's Crisis and Covenant. It's by no means the best of his early works. My favorite of his early works is, my personal favorite of his early works at the moment, at least, is One People, ? Crisis and Covenant is more like a survey of contemporary Jewish thought than it is anything distinctively his, apart from the last chapter, which is a real barnstormer. And that was what a lot of this class was based upon. But the thing I wanted to try and communicate through this class is that Rabbi Sacks was more often than not a public intellectual rather than a philosopher or a sociologist or a halachist, or he was a public intellectual and a parshan, you know, a commentator on the Torah par excellence. But if you dig deep into the work of Rabbi Sacks, and sometimes you have to sharpen things which were left kind of at the level of a platitude because he was trying to speak to a very broad audience. But if you're willing to do the work, I think there's tremendous philosophical depth that he has left us the job of mining. And today we started that process together. You know, he doesn't talk about non-propositional knowledge. He doesn't talk about the private language argument. A lot of what I was doing was supplementing his thought to try and pick out, you know, what he's saying. He doesn't make the distinction between what he means by Torah isn't, you know, the verses of the Torah. It's when he is juxtaposing Torah and wisdom, he means something much more narrow, I think. He means the non-propositional content carried by Torah. So there's a lot of work to do, but I hope you agree with me that it could be gratifying, even if there'll be things we'll disagree with too. I mean, he was a controversial thinker as well, with his own particular views. There was one more question, Sarah.
Yes, Nissan.
Rabbi Dr. Sam.
Nice to see you.
Oh, it's so good to see you. I miss being in the same room with you.
Me too.
My question is about non-propositional knowledge of other cultures. You alerted us in the very beginning of tonight's talk to the Talmudic passage in Pesachim. It's page 87b.
Yes.
And 4 lines off the wide line. B'amar Rebbe Eliezer lo hegla HaKadosh Baruch Hu et Yisrael. The Holy One, blessed be He, did not exile Israel, Lebein ha'umot, among the nations, Ela Kedei, and this is the key word, Shei Tosafu Alehem Gerim, and then it brings a proof text. Tosafu Alehem Gerim, which you've gotten me to think really means to have the Gerim add their non-propositional experience and knowledge to us. I mean, that's what I'm asking your opinion, if this is a correct reading.
Yes, I think that's a beautiful reading. I once heard it taught in the name of Rav Kook. There's a well-known midrash in Shir HaShirim Rabbah, which says the Mashiach comes and says, "All right, Jews, get on the next El Al plane back to Israel. You know, Mashiach's come, it's the end. Come on, let's build our temple." And the Jews say, "Oh, hold on a minute, no. In the exile, my family has been through country A, country B, and country C, but there are so many other countries my family hasn't been through. And it's quite clear in the Midrash that the idea is we have to teach all the nations of the world. We have to be an Or LaGoyim to all the nations of the world. And the Mashiach says, don't worry, your family's been through country A, B, and C, but another Jewish family has been through D, E, and F, and another Jewish family. So now it's time to come home. I heard in the name of Rav Kook a kind of Midrash on the Midrash, where the Jewish people says, okay, that's very nice, Mashiach, but there's another reason why we're not ready to come home. I've only been to countries A, B, and C, so I've only been able to learn, our family's only been able to learn what there is to learn from the culture of country A, B, and C, and my family hasn't been able to learn what there is to learn from the country of D, E, and F. And Rav Kook says the Mashiach's response to that will be, don't worry, when you get back to Israel, the other families of the Jewish people will teach you what they learned in the countries that your family didn't come through. So yes, I think there is this notion, and it's a beautiful reading of the Gemara in Pesachim, Nisan, thank you for sharing it with us, where what we gain from the converts isn't just that new members, but they're able to somehow bring some of the culturally acquired wisdom that they carry through their non-Jewish culture. They may be able to filter some of that back into the community that they join. So thank you for sharing that. That's a beautiful idea.
Thank you as always.
So on that note thank you, Sam, for staying up till after 4 a.m. for us.
My pleasure. Isn't it Shavuot tonight? Someone told me it was Shavuot.
Right. I do also want to thank everyone that attended on all of our various platforms. And then finally, I do want to give a quick plug for upcoming programming. We just published all of our details for Tisha B'Av, which is in about less than 2 weeks. So I would recommend that you go check that out at www.drisha.org/classes. Also, you can find both recordings of this lecture and all of Sam's previous lectures for Drisha at www.drisha.org/audio library. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. Take care, everybody. Good night, good morning, I don't know. Bye.